Now let's talk about some of the other different slicer types that you might need. Another slicer version you can enable in the formatting options is a horizontal slicer, which can be handy for fields that only have a few values. This slicer type is enabled by changing the orientation setting from vertical to horizontal under the general settings of the slicer, and it results in a slicer that looks like this. Another useful horizontal slicer is called a slider slicer. We'll just call it a slider to keep things simple. Sliders are great when you need to use numeric or date type fields to filter your data. Just as you can use the caret to switch between a list or a drop-down slicer, if you are using numbers or dates in the slicer visual, you will see additional slicer types, like between, which let you make sliders. Sliders are extremely useful because they let users select a range of values by either typing in what they want to see or sliding the dials, hence the name. Some of the different slicer types only appear when you are using a date field. Sliders are quite useful when it is difficult to predict which time intervals that your stakeholders might want to view. However, you will also notice some relative options when choosing your slicer type for a date field. The relative date slicer lets users look at a rolling time period, like the last year, the last 90 days, or the past 2 months. Our last slicer is called a hierarchy slicer, and these are very easy to make. All you have to do is add multiple fields to your slicer, as you see here, and Power BI will do the rest. Hierarchy slicers are helpful when your users need to make specific selections from related fields simultaneously. If that's confusing, let's focus on a common example like years and months. Let's say you wanted to compare January through March 2020 against October through December of 2019. A hierarchy slicer groups our month field by each year so that this is possible, as you see in the slicer example. Basically, this slicer type helps your users filter values from one field within the values of another field, allowing for more granular and specific selections. Before we wrap up this discussion of slicers, there's one more thing you should know, even though it's slightly outside the scope of this course. Just as filters can be assigned to multiple report pages, slicers can be synced across pages by using the Sync Slicers pane, which you can enable using the View tab in your Power BI ribbon. The Sync Slicers pane lets you click on a slicer and decide whether to copy and sync that slicer to other pages in your report. For example, if you have slicers that you want to include on 2 pages of your report, you can sync them so that slicer selections made on one page will automatically carry over to the second page. And that concludes our lesson on slicers. As a quick recap, slicers are very similar to filters, except for a few key differences. First, slicers are visuals, just like bar charts or line charts. They have many options that you can customize, such as a search bar or select all. And they also have many types, including the slider, horizontal, and drop-down slicer. Depending on the type of data you put in the slicer visual, the different styles you can choose from might vary, but almost all of them are extremely useful in their own way.